Yeah, so we go up, then we go up, come down side and then walk on this
When pin, is that? When we time, man, when we want to I see.
Testing 1, 2. Testing 1. Testing 1, 2.
Check.
Good evening, ladies, gentlemen, fellow Vincentians. I would like to take this opportunity to invite you all to stand so that we can pay homage to our national anthem. The national anthem will be performed by our well and versed, talented Vincentian, Mr. Jamoro Francis. And thank you, Jamoro. And again, ladies and gentlemen, I would invite you to continue standing as we move towards the invocation to be given by none other than our own Father Orlando Williams. Please.
The psalmist exclaims in Psalm 95, "O come, let us sing out to the Lord. Let us shout in triumph to the rock of our salvation, for the Lord is a great God, a great King above all gods." Almighty God, you created us in your own image and likeness. We thank you for all warriors in our history who have contended against evil and fought fearlessly for our freedom. Help us to reverently use our freedom responsibly, that justice, equality, and fair play might be manifested and maintained in our St. Vincent and the Grenadines. We confess our failure throughout these 43 years of nationhood to fully reveal your image and likeness. Drugs, crime, violence, especially against women, and broken homes still lurk on every hand. We confess our hatred and failure to show kindness, our injury of one another in thought, word, and deed, our uncharitable thoughts, prejudice, contempt towards those who differ from us, especially politically. We beg your acceptance for our repentance. We thank you for our abundant blessings to our families, our children and youth, the bridge to the future, and all those who guide and nurture them. We thank you for the gift of the UE that has provided intellectual development to so many of us over the years. We thank you for this gift. We thank you for minds to think, for health and strength to work and play. Guide the thoughts and words of our guest lecturer this evening. May all he says allow us to reflect on where we are and where we need to go, and all be done to your glory and honor. We make these prayers through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Please be seated, and thank you, Father Williams. Again, a pleasant good evening to all, and before I make any further statement or intervention, I would like to first of all introduce myself. My name is Julian Jack. I am your chair for this evening's proceedings. My task is a very simple one, and I would like to begin that task by first of all recognizing the leader of the opposition, the Honorable Dr. Goodwin Friday, who has taken time to be with us here this evening. We are very thankful for your presence. Also, I would like to recognize at this time the members or members of the Education Ministry who are here present with us this evening. I recognize that there is Mr. Godwin James, a Senior Education Officer, who is amongst our presence. I would also like to recognize the very person who we are here to listen to this evening in the person of none other than Professor Joel Warrican, who will be our guest lecturer this evening to present to you this topic, which I believe most of you would be quite aware of by now, which is before you on your booklets or pamphlet. I would also like to take this opportunity to recognize Mrs. Deborah Dalrymple, the head of site of the University of the West Indies Open Campus. And Deborah has been indeed a stalwart here at the university and has been very instrumental in putting on these events, as you may come to have known them over the years. I would also like to recognize, and I see a battery of historians among the crowd or among the audience, in the persons of Dr. Adrian Fraser, Dr. Arnold Thomas, and of course any other who might be here as historians and also writers. As a matter of fact, I see here with us this evening our very own Cecil Blazer writer, who has been indeed one of the prolific writers here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I would also like to take this time to recognize that among us also, and most importantly, are staff and students of the Open University campus. Very important. Their work has been also pretty much valuable in bringing to fruition what we are this evening experiencing by way of our attendance here. And I would also take the opportunity to welcome, of course, special invited guests, members of the media, our internet audience, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, fellow Vincentians here in St. Vincent, and of course in the diaspora, wherever you may be. I say to you a welcome, and to extend, of course, my statements with regard to recognition of all persons who are amongst us this evening. I would like to also recognize the attendance of the Honorable Minister of Education in the person of our very own Curtis. I say Curtis and Curtis. Yes, and I thank you for your appearance as well. My task this evening, as I said, is a simple one, and it is to guide you through the process of this evening's event. And my duty in doing so is to ensure that we can have what is a smooth running or smooth flowing program, as has been etched out to you by way of the program you have before you, and to do so within the allocated time that we may have to do all that is listed here. This evening's topic is indeed a very important one as we reflect on the anniversary of our national political independence over the last 43 years or so. Well, 43 years. Now, 43 years in the life of any nation is, in many instances or circumstances, a relatively young one. There are indeed countries that have, we know, celebration of the annual independence for over a century, sometimes more than a century, and hundreds of years, so to speak. So one could only imagine that in regard to our own celebration, we can consider ourselves to be pretty nascent and an emerging nation in that regard. Nonetheless, what is important is that we can always take the opportunity as we celebrate our independence to reflect on our past and to also consider what are the opportunities as we move forward to think in terms of our own creative abilities as to the best ways in which we may solve problems and, of course, the challenges that confront us as a young and emerging nation. This evening's lecture, I believe, will provide you with tremendous insights with regard to the system of education that we have inherited as a young nation and a post-colonial nation, as a matter of fact, and to see what is probably the issues that we must contend with now that we are in an ever-changing global environment, and to chart the way forward in terms of what would be the new education thrust that would respond to whatever challenges there are in the new dispensation, and of course, given what we are confronted with as the new global architecture emerges. Now, I do not wish to labor anymore the issue with regard to what are the issues, potentially and otherwise, with regard to our education system and the need for any such reform that may be required to bring it to a place where it would be more relevant to our national development and to be able to provide our young youth and persons with the educational skill and, of course, the abilities to fully participate in nationhood and national development. I would like to take this opportunity, therefore, to call upon Deborah, as I affectionately refer to her, to bring you welcome and greeting on this occasion. I welcome you, Deborah.
Honorable Curtis King, Minister of Education, Honorable Dr. Godwin Friday, Leader of the Opposition, Dr. Godwin James, I think you're representing the senior members of the Ministry of Education, Professor Gerald Warrican, Director of the School of Education, Cave Hill Campus, and our very special guests, staff and students of the Open Campus, specially invited guests, members of the media, our internet audience, of course. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our lecture this evening. Our lecture has been renamed the Sir K. Dwight Venner Memorial Independence Lecture. We've had independence lectures for many, many years, but recently we've renamed the lecture. And this follows the decision by the University of the West Indies Open Campus to rename our lecture series as Memorial Lectures in honor of outstanding nationals who have made sterling contribution to the development of our countries and indeed of the region. A very special welcome to our guest lecturer this evening, Professor Joel Warrican, who would be introduced more fully later in the program. Welcome, Professor. This is the third event which we will be hosting in our recently renovated facilities. We are very happy to be back. And to also welcome you back as well. We recently hosted a country conference entitled History, Ancestry, and Heritage, and the Oscar Allen Memorial Emancipation Lecture. Then and now, it is quite delightful to look out at the audience and see some familiar faces. We welcome you as we do those persons who may be attending a function here for the first time. Please do keep yourselves apprised of future events, as it is our aim to have you, the members of our community, participate in our activities. The Friends of the Open Campus SVG know that we place much stock in community involvement, and lately we have dubbed this community outreach as community empowerment. We believe that this empowerment is not only reflected in the numbers of graduates, but also in the cross-fertilization of ideas through lectures and workshops, by involvement in the literary fair and exposure to the arts, and through the opportunity for self-directed growth by accessing continuing and professional education. The Open Campus is the representation of the University of the West Indies, our university, at the local level. And tonight is yet another opportunity for the UWI to deepen its footprint in the country. At these lectures, which celebrate our independence, we have tried to engage scholars who are sons and daughters of the soil, to look at independence through the lens of their own profession. Professor Justin Robinson, Professor Rhoda Reddock, Professor Richard Robertson, Dr. Adrian Fraser, Mr. Herbert Samuel, among many others. My list wasn't much longer, but I thought I'd cut it down for time. But they've all presented at the Independence Lecture. This evening, we look forward to hearing Professor Warrican's perspective on the topic, independence or independence, unmasking the fallacy of education rooted in colonial traditions. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and I hope you do enjoy the lecture and participate. Thank you.
Without any further ado, we will continue, and we will hear again from Jamoro Francis, a special rendition which he has prepared and which he is very happy to perform this evening here for us. Thank you very much, Jamoro, and that I consider to be a very fitting rendition, given the fact that we are here this evening to listen to our guest lecturer speak on the issue of, or subject matter of, education. And what better way can one liberate one's mind when we hear of the songs of Bob Marley and we hear of the freedom and emancipation of mind? We must consider it apt that education is pivotal and critical to the emancipating of one's mind, especially because education is and must be intended to engender and encourage free thinking, critical thinking. Absolutely. I would like to take this opportunity at this point in time to welcome to the podium Mrs. Camille Akron to introduce our guest speaker this evening. Mrs. Lackram.
Okay. A pleasant evening to all, our internet audience, as well as our in-person audience. It is quite a pleasure to see so many faces after the horrors of COVID. It's nice to be human once again and to connect once again. Protocol having been well established by Mrs. Dalrymple, I shall proceed with Professor Warrican's introduction. Professor Joel Warrican is a professor of education who has been in the field of education for over 35 years. As a trained teacher, he has taught at all levels, from nursery to tertiary. He holds a B.Ed in Language Arts Education with first-class honors from the University of the West Indies, an M.Phil degree in research methods, and a Ph.D. in education with a focus on language and literacy, both from the University of Cambridge in the UK. He also completed first year, all courses, for the M.Phil degree in special education at the Cave Hill campus of the UE. He moved on to the UK on scholarship before completing his research year. Professor Warrican has held several leadership positions for many years in his career. He headed the Teacher Education Division of the H. Laverty Stout Community College in the British Virgin Islands. He was the planning officer and then the director of academic programming and delivery within the UWI Open Campus. He was the academic coordinator of the Eastern Caribbean Joint Board of Teacher Education and was a significant contributor to the revival of this body that regulates the premier teacher education programs in the Eastern Caribbean. He was the director of the St. Vincent and the Grenadines Community College, where he had the responsibility of merging the formerly independent post-secondary institutions there into a single entity with a single governance. He is currently the chairman of the board of directors at that institution. Professor Warrican is currently in his second term as the director of the School of Education at the Cave Hill campus of the UE, where he is leading several innovations to update and upgrade that department. He has and continues to make a significant mark as an academic. He has published, alone or jointly, 6 books and monographs. The latest one, Anti-Racism for Literacy Teachers Across the Black Diaspora, is currently in preparation to be published by the Cambridge University Press. He has produced, either single-authored or co-authored, over 50 academic papers, some in highly ranked journals, and over 50 technical papers. His first internationally published paper on action research has been on reading lists for research methods courses for many years. His scholarship has earned him invitations to speak regionally and internationally. Professor Warrican brings to the table several years' experience writing proposals for and managing grants and consultancies. Please join me in welcoming Professor Warrican as he delivers his address.
Okay. Honorable Curtis King, Minister of Education. Dr. the Honorable Godwin Friday, Leader of the Opposition, Education Officer, Dr. Godwin James, Mistress Deborah Dalrymple, Head of Site, UE Open Campus, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, staff and students of the Open Campus, specially invited guests, members of the media, our internet audience, ladies and gentlemen, friends of the university, good evening. I find it a little bit strange to be hearing, welcome to St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I mean, I'm very much still Vincentian, and even though I may be working at the UE Cave campus in Barbados, I spend lots of time in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I am Vincentian, I'm proud to be Vincentian, and I should be welcome some people here. It's even a bit strange to hear welcome to the Open Campus, because I spent significant time working at the Open Campus. In fact, I was a planning officer when the plans were being drafted up for the remodeling of this building. So this is like home to me. You know, it's really an honor to speak at this Dwight Venner Memorial Independence lecture. So Dwight was one of our Caribbean luminaries, and to me it's a great honor to speak at a session that memorializes him. Ladies and gentlemen, I just want to say, tonight I'm speaking on the topic of independence or independence, unmasking the fallacy of education rooted in colonial times. But I must say that I am not coming here with any surefire solutions. I would like to stimulate some thought, but don't expect that all the solutions are going to be had here tonight. Additionally, I must say, even though we're still celebrating independence, I am very much a regionalist. I am a Caribbean person, and I do not think that a topic of this nature should be rooted just in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So I'm going to speak from a Caribbean position. And this, in a sense, would avoid some of the political thoughts that can go with it. You know, we're going to speak from a regional perspective to unlock some of the things, unmask some of the things that we need to look at in our education in the region. I think our education has a long way to go. But we must remember that many of us, our nations, they're all quite young. St. Vincent, 43 years. Some countries, just 50 years, 60 years. That is quite young in the path of development. And for a people who have been colonized, who have been enslaved, who have had an education thrusted upon us, we are still caught in it, and we have to find ways to get out. And that's what I want to talk about. So from a regional point of view. Before we go further, I must say it is very important that we consider the purpose of education. I mean, to unlock what we want to do, we must understand this purpose. And to think about the purpose of education, we have to think about it philosophically. It was the great philosopher Aristotle that said, and I quote, "Education should be regulated by law and should be an affair of state. This cannot be denied. But what should be the character of this public education and how young persons should be educated are questions which remain to be considered. As things are, there is disagreement about the subjects, for mankind are by no means agreed about the things to be taught. Whether we look to virtue or the best life, there can't be any agreement. Neither is it clear whether education is more concerned with intellectual or with moral virtue. The absence of agreement on the purpose of education is reflected in the different perspectives that over the years have informed the development of programs of education. In the early 20th century, there was perennialism, a perspective held by philosophers such as the American Mortimer Adler, who held the position that education should lead to the living of a virtuous life. Children were to be taught subjects that embodied universal, unchanging truths. It was not to be about practicality, not at all. It was about exploring the human condition through, for example, the study of the great books, literature, with a view to develop virtue and high morals. This teacher-centered approach to education saw teachers delivering information determined to be good for them, the students, whether they liked it or not. And you know in those days, it was followed by a beating if you were not doing your work very well. Students were perceived as passive receivers who regurgitate facts on demand. Perhaps in response to this perspective, progressivism emerged, credited to the American philosopher, psychologist, and educator John Dewey, who is referred to as the father of progressivism. This philosophical perspective supports the notion that students should not be receptacles to be filled, but should engage in active learning. Students are encouraged to learn through play, hands-on experiences, and socializing. This student-centered approach is sometimes criticized by those who viewed it as catering to fanciful ideas of students at the expense of learning content. But supporters of progressivism suggest that with proper planning, students can experience meaningful learning, while at the same time develop characteristics such as creativity, problem solving, and excitement as lifelong learners, which from the perspective of progressivists is a significant part of the purpose of education. So I go into a third perspective. This perspective says the purpose of education, and here I'm talking about essentialism, and this one was espoused by the former president of the American nation of Tanzania, Julius Nyerere, was president at the time. And Nyerere says in a speech given in Dar es Salaam, which is referred to as the Declaration of Dar es Salaam, in the 1970s, that the purpose of education, I quote, is the liberation of man, and note the sexism, we're talking a lot about man, but that was the time, but I'm quoting directly. The liberation of man from the restraints and limitation of ignorance and dependency. He argued for an education for self-reliance, where the self encompass not only the individual, but also the community that sustains the individual. In explaining his philosophy of education for self-reliance, Nyerere posited that, and I quote, the ideas imparted by education or released in the minds through education should therefore be liberating ideas. The skills acquired by education should be liberating skills. Nothing else can properly be called education. Teaching which induces a slave mentality or sense of impotence is not education at all. It is an attack on the minds of men. I find this latter philosophical perspective rather interesting because the situation that existed in Tanzania at the time that Nyerere made these telling statements is now being reflected in our country and region today. Nyerere lamented that the content of education was divorced from the real lives of the children from the society in which they lived. The attitudes of those receiving education at a certain level believed that it made them better than those who were not so privileged. Students' worth was measured by the number of examination passes they received rather than by their character. Teaching was often linked to anticipated examination content and not to what students should actually learn. Does this not sound familiar? But the purpose of education is not always strictly philosophical. Sometimes it can have very practical and perhaps devious motive. It was Nelson Mandela who opined that education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. So I want to focus on two words here, powerful and weapon. Education as a powerful weapon. I wish to suggest that in our region, where we had a dependence, where we were in chains and shackled, and we are still struggling from this, trying to escape it, that education may possibly have been used as a weapon. Remember, a weapon is used to protect oneself and one's interests. And that is how education was used by those who implemented the system that we inherited. The colonizers of our region used education to subjugate a people, to entice the people to serve the interests of their colonial masters, while at the same time believing that they, the people, were benefiting. It was the weapon that taught the people that anything that originated with them was inferior to the products of their masters. And we still see that. We still see whenever we produce something in education, at the university level, at the college level, it is likely to come under attack. Bring it in from the UK, bring it in from the US, it's accepted. Perhaps the success of this weapon lies in the fact that the ones wielding it were so skilled in its use that the victims were convinced, and even now continue to be convinced, that they're actually benefiting from its use. So much so that when the wielder leaves the scene of the battle, and it was a battle, a brutal one, the victims take up the weapon and wield it themselves, believing that without it, they are in some way deprived. Think about it. An intruder comes into your house, uses a weapon to force you and your family to hand over all your valuables to him. But he smiles at you, and he tells you that you are better off without these things, and that in fact, they are not as valuable as the replacements he has brought with him. He is so successful that you eagerly hand over your valuables and cherish the imitations that he has left behind. This analogy, aptly in my opinion, applies to what was done by the colonizers of our region. They introduced a system of education that is paternalistic in nature, one that selects the brightest, so they think, the brightest minds in the society, and trains them for jobs that perpetuate the ideals of the colonizer, even in their absence. The system teases the colonized with the notion that anybody can be the recipient of this honor, with the notion, can be the recipient of this honor, that it is the best and fairest way of ensuring that this opportunity is open to all. It seduces the colonized into believing that it is their best chance of improving their social and economic conditions. It transfixes them into a state of such dependence that they do not even trust their own judgments. Everything that they do, that they think, that they value, must be validated by those who they believe are better than they are. But let us examine the evidence to see what really obtains. Education is a powerful weapon, remember that. It can ward off conditions such as ignorance, prejudice, poverty, and dependence. But paradoxically, it can also reproduce the same conditions. Let us, for example, reflect on some of the ways in which education in our region continues the work of the colonizer in keeping the people in ignorance, in dependence. So we start with the curriculum. If you ask any self-respecting educator in this region, he or she will tell you that our school curriculum is outdated and has been for many years. The content is burdensome, with new content being added on a regular basis. But nothing is being removed. That's the problem. It seems that at every turn, there are so-called add-ons, things that are asked to go on to the curriculum, perhaps to address some social ill that is coming to the fore, or to conform to trends in more developed countries. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with adjusting the content of the curriculum. Indeed, it is recommended, but it becomes burdensome, too burdensome, when the additions are done in an ad hoc manner, often merely appending the new materials to the existing structure. That I call the new wine in old wineskin approach. So that over the years, clinging tenaciously to the curriculum model left by the colonizers, we have added new content areas. We heard of the call, and we are hearing the call for the emphasis on STEM, and that is great. And of late, robotics. This all sounds very exciting. It is indeed exciting, and it is noble, but we still have to ask ourselves, at what price, if nothing is being removed? The curriculum is so packed that students in primary schools are now encountering content that was once taught at the university level, with little time to really learn much. The curriculum is still biased heavily in favor of the traditional subjects that are highly valued, even if not always relevant to the students' lives, or at least not in the way in which they're served up in classrooms. We are preparing students for jobs that either no longer exist, that will be out of existence by the time they're ready for the world of work, or that are already oversaturated. But the content that is more relevant to the current and anticipated future are seen as add-ons, quite often for students who are deemed not smart enough to do the real rigorous learning, thus perpetuating the prejudices that alienate large proportions of our future workforce. The ones who may have the potential to produce the non-traditional innovations that could contribute to the improvement of the lives of their families, their communities, and their countries, and to the strengthening of the economies of these small states. In a nutshell, the outdated, overloaded curriculum that we seem to hold dear keeps us in dependence, constantly relying on the outside sources to shore up our economies. But there is more. Part of this illusion of progress in education and through education, linked to the flooding of the curriculum with new content, is the so-called transformation in the approach to instruction. In the late 1990s, there was a huge outcry for less teacher-centeredness in the classroom, less of the stage and more of the guide. We touted differentiated instruction, but still upheld the view that have students of different levels of academic prowess in the same classroom would disadvantage the more able ones. We heard about constructivism and student-centered instruction. We heard of active learning and student collaboration. We heard of cooperative learning and group work. We heard of critical thinking and independent learning, and we were thrilled. But it was all an illusion across the region, an illusion in my opinion. An ideal that was at best partially implemented in the confines of practices such as streaming. There's nothing good about streaming. Students are streamed according to ability in schools and classrooms. We talk about collaboration, but our methods encourage competition. I have a colleague who tells the story of visiting a classroom where a trainee teacher was doing her practicum for certification. My colleague reports that she was happy to see that the plan for the lesson included group work, and that the teacher had actually organized the students in groups. Excellent. There were groups where the more able students were matched up with the less able ones. Excellent. She was, however, appalled to see one little girl using her textbooks to build a little fort around herself. And her exercise books were being used also. She was speaking out occasionally to say something to the other students. The teacher did nothing about it. Indeed, the teacher went behind the fort with the little girl to mark her work. At the end of the class, when this was raised with the teacher, she replied that the little girl was the bright spark in the class, and she, the student, did not want the others in the group to copy her answers. The trainee teacher, who could speak about the benefits of cooperative learning and collaboration, who could write an acceptable lesson plan and reflect on the strategies in instruction, had no problem with the child's behavior. After all, in our system, the weaker students have to do their work and learn for themselves. Yes, the embracing of cooperation and the collaboration that all agree are needed for our societies to become stronger are but just an illusion in our classroom. A situation that keeps our people divided in our countries and keep our countries' independence, relying on outside sources to shore up our economies. It is impossible to speak about competition in our education system without turning to the assessment practices. I have spoken on many occasions and in different fora about the injustices of these practices that do not only promote competition, but also perpetuate elitism in a very unhealthy and unproductive way. For example, no matter what we call it, the primary school exit assessments that take the form of a highly competitive examination seems to be firmly entrenched. At the end of primary education phase, students compete for places in secondary schools, not because they are limited spaces. Indeed, in the region, we boast of universal secondary education, but because there are limited spaces in the prestigious schools. And the competition is fierce, very fierce, not only among the students to get in, but among schools that make their reputation by sending large proportions of their exiting students to these prestigious secondary schools. The despair at failing to gain a place in one of these traditional schools with the British grammar school-like history has led some students in the region to end their lives before they have had a chance to live. Such is the powerful desire for the status and prestige of wearing certain school uniforms, and the even stronger yen to avoid the identifying mark of schools that are deemed failing. Colleagues, this hierarchical organization of schools that we have inherited was a tool used by the colonizer to divide the society into the various classes of citizens. I was recently watching an episode of the series called Torchwood. I don't know if any of you have ever looked at it. But in season 3, episode 4, the purpose of this kind of education becomes evident. The setting is this. Aliens are invading the earth, as they tend to do from time to time in television shows. They are demanding a fee. What is this fee? They are demanding a fee to not destroy all of the earth, and this fee is 10% of the earth's children. The scene that captured my attention shows how the British government, remember, this is just a story, how the British government portrayed in the series chose their 10%. Have a look.
about nieces and nephews.
Don't push your luck.
You seriously expect me to look my brother in the eye?
We need to limit
may
the
not
number
come
of
to that
people
anyway.
who
In the
know.
eye, and what? Just give him a condolence card.
That's the responsibility of government,
No,
Denise.
the first responsibility is to protect the best interests of this country, right? Then let's say it. In a national emergency, a country must plan for the future and discriminate between those who are vital to continued stability and those who are not. And now that we've established that our kids are exempt, the whole principle of random selection is dead in the water
Only
anyway.
so far as
Let me finish. Now look. On the one hand, you've got the good schools, and I don't just mean those producing graduates. I mean the pupils who will go on to staff our hospitals, our offices, our factories, the workforce of the future. We need them. Accepted, yes? So, set against that, you've got the failing schools, full of the less able, the less socially useful, those destined to spend a lifetime on benefits, occupying places on the dole queue and, frankly, the prisons. Now look, should we treat them equally? God knows we've tried and we've failed, and now the time has come to choose. And if we can't identify the lowest achieving 10% of this country's children, then what are the school league tables for?
Anyone want to speak against that? Then there we have it. John, you have your criteria. We've selected the 10%.
There we have it. I'm sure that you all recognize this hierarchical structure. In each of the countries in the region, people know the schools that would make up the 10% should aliens ever make such a demand of them. The fact is that our examination-driven culture at both the primary and secondary school levels neutralize a substantial proportion of the youth of our small states. Schools are not so much places of learning as they are places of passing examinations. Learning is optional. A student on exiting secondary school may earn 15 certificates at grade 1, but cannot use the knowledge and skills he or she was supposed to have acquired to do anything practical. Thus, in effect, we have two categories of young people that are rendered inactive by our examination culture. Those who fail from primary school onward, who are made to feel valueless, and those who have passed a clutch of examinations and are well certified for employment, but the job requires different knowledge and skills from the certificates earned. These latter ones, educated to see themselves as better than those with fewer academic qualifications, may not want to sully their hands with the work that is available. As Nayeri pointed out several decades ago, they all expect to find high-paying jobs to earn the kind of money befitting of their elevated status. Assessment practices that keep so many of our young people, our strong young citizens, from participating in the building of communities, keep these small states in poverty and independence, relying on support from outside to shore up their economies. Another area that must be considered is that of teacher education. Though we have endeavored to adjust the approach to teacher education to meet the perceived needs of the profession, more still needs to be done. For example, teachers are being prepared to teach students that no longer exist. Today, students have come into the world in which technology is prevalent and used for many daily activities. Yet, teachers are not properly trained to use this resource in their practice. Indeed, until early 2020, when we were met with the consequences of COVID-19, many technology devices were pretty much banned in schools. Teachers viewed these devices, and principals also, such as mobile phones and tablets, with suspicion and spoke of them as distractions that interfered with the real purpose of education, learning. In fact, many ministries of education in the region supported this policy. It was only when the pandemic surfaced that many in education acknowledged that, sometimes with great reluctance, that technology can be useful in education. Indeed, some teachers initially made it clear that they would use the technology because they had to. But the minute the restrictions imposed as a result of the pandemic were removed, they would be going back to business as usual. We are already seeing some of that. These teachers failed to realize that not using the technology in education robbed the students of the opportunity to learn to use a resource that is here to stay, a resource that is part of the students' daily lives, and that they're deliberately ignoring this resource is like condemning the students to an era that has long been over. Teacher education that does not properly prepare teachers to make the best use of technology in teaching and learning perpetuates the ignorance that limits the potential of a powerful resource. And it keeps the countries in the region independent as consumers of other countries' technology innovation, rather than producers of products and services that can be exported, thus earning revenue that contribute to the growth of local economies. All of these are features of the education system in the region that contribute to our small developing states being held captive, independence, even when we have declared political independence from our colonizers. But there's something that is perhaps a bit more insidious. When the colonizers administered the education system, the divide was a racial issue. White colonizers subjugating black and brown colonized, and to a lesser extent, class. Planter whites versus poor whites, who came to the region as indentured servants to work in agriculture with a promise of land at the end of the period of service. In our modern societies, however, race is less of an issue than class. The white colonizer is no longer pulling the purse strings or controlling the wealth. Not fully, but we know strongly. Rather, it is people who look like us, many of whom benefited personally from the tidbits thrown out by the colonial powers, and who have mastered the art of oppression, moving the debate from one that was primarily linked to racism to one that is now linked to classism. These are the products of education systems that promote elitism, that foster divisions in the society, and that relegate large proportions of our population in dependence, dependent on handouts and patronage. Many of these may be comparable to the 10% described in the video clip. Having been packed into failing schools, they are marshaled through the education system and released at the earliest possible time with the stamp of failure pinned to their foreheads. Not surprising, these unfortunate souls are more often than not of the working class, relegated to minimum wage employment or unemployment. Not necessarily unintelligent, just not part of the elite club that is prone to tell you where they did their secondary school education before they tell you their names. A system of education that shames a large proportion of the region's young people rather than nurture and encourage them to make a meaningful contribution to the development of their community and country and region is an education system that must be replaced, and the sooner the better. I hope that by now you're wondering what the answer is. It is often very easy to point out the problem, but not so easy to find solutions. I can tell you there is definitely no easy fix. It will take planning, it will take fortitude, it will take patience and grit to bring about the changes that are needed to break that cycle of dependence. But it is not impossible. I would like to point out that there are people who are working behind the scenes to prevent that kind of education to happen. I would like to paint for you my vision of an education system that would promote true independence. But first, I believe that it is important that we have a shared understanding of what is meant by an independent country in this region. In my opinion, independence closely resembles Nyeri's notion of self-reliance. In an independent country, all citizens are valued, whatever their talents, and these talents are used to contribute to the well-beings of individuals, communities, country, region, and ultimately the globe. This is supported by a system of education that emphasizes self-reliance at the level of the individual, the family, and the community, of course, the region. Clear stock is taken of available resources, and these are used creatively to generate wealth, not only for the self, but also for the community. Here are some other features that I would like to highlight. Perhaps the first action that I'm going to suggest that we take is the retooling of key personnel in education. For example, let's start with teachers. Teachers must be retrained with all the ideals that are to be emphasized, firmly embedded in that training, and there must be a schedule for them to engage in regular professional development, thus constantly upgrading and updating their skills. I want to say that I'm seeing this already happening. I'm seeing the ministries of education in the region, the ministries of education in the region, taking stock of this. I'm seeing the OECS Commission taking stock of this. I'm seeing the Caribbean Development Bank taking stock of this. CARICOM taking stock of this. But much more have to be done. Likewise, principals must also have a system of training with regular professional development to ensure that they're not just managers of school plans, but leaders. Management and leadership are two different things. There must be leaders who are well-equipped to make evidence-based decisions that can have an impact on the students' achievements. And of course, we have to think about ministries of education personnel. These personnel must also be prepared for the role that they are to play. Currently in the region, it is often the practice to appoint education officers, even chief education officers, by identifying teachers and administrators in schools who may be doing an excellent job and then promoting them to these positions. So they're good teachers, they're good principals, and you make them education officers. That is understandable, but there's more to be done. Though they may have the qualifications in education, masters, PhDs, and so forth, they're often not equipped with the specific knowledge and skills to lead at this level in education, a system level. So what am I suggesting? I am saying that like teachers, like principals, there must be some special training for ministry personnel. As you're entering that ministry, you should be exposed to a particular training that tells you what is the vision of schooling in the Caribbean, what is the vision of education in the Caribbean, what do we want our education system to do. That is the type of training that they need to be exposed to. Every education officer should undergo that type of training. And then there should be community engagement. This is so vital. Parents and other members of the community must be encouraged through education to buy in, to embrace the intentions of the revised school programs. They must be helped to understand how the introduced changes would benefit their children, both now and in the future, as well as how it would benefit themselves and their wider community. I recognize that this is not easy. I keep emphasizing that, as we are talking about breaking down centuries of indoctrination. But I believe that patience and demonstrated results would eventually win most of our society community over. They would be involved at all levels where it is appropriate. The new ideas should be taken into the community. That is very important. So remember, we are not talking about a quick fix here. We are talking about removing a deeply entrenched structure that is an integral part of our societal fabric. We cannot expect that it will be dismantled without resistance. But I believe with adequate training and preparation, persistence, grit, and patience, the new ideals can become the way of doing things. With a shared perspective on the purpose of education, I believe that it can be accomplished over time. The curriculum for such a system would be diverse. This is my vision, remember. It would be diverse, so much so as to cater to the needs of the country and the interests of the students. Technical vocational education, very much undervalued. Subjects would be as prestigious as the so-called academic ones. They must be raised in prestige. This would be an extremely valuable aspect of the curriculum that would remove the overemphasis on subjects or content that are no longer relevant, rather than seen as learning a trade because they are not smart enough to learn rigorous academic content. Technical and vocational subjects would be compulsory for all learners at some level in the school system. These are the areas that are currently needed to ensure that young citizens are exposed to knowledge and skills necessary to build the countries in the region. Colleagues, linked to the curriculum also, but deserving of special mention, is the notion of assessment. Education that supports self-reliance must include the removal of the burdensome system of assessment that we inherited, with its overemphasis on examinations. At the primary level, we have seen the change of name from Common Entrance Examination to the Caribbean Primary Exit Assessment, CPEA, in some of our countries, and inserting some continuous assessment activities that is supposed to make it better. But that is like throwing a lambskin jacket over a lion. It still roars. The assessment is still burdensome and now puts extra pressure on teachers with the continuous assessment component. And there are even stories of students having their work done by their parents and others to meet the requirement. And worse, the results of the assessments are still used to rank students and assign them to secondary schools in a hierarchical manner. New clothes, but the lion is still roaring and devouring our children. This lion must be silenced for there to be any meaningful advancement. Remember Torchwood. At the secondary level, the system of writing school exit examinations must also be replaced. The existing system leads to the failure of large proportions of our students. Either they do not have the opportunity to take the certifying exam. Some schools block the students if they think they're not going to pass. And remember, we're talking about the region. They do not have the opportunity to take the certifying examinations in the first place, or they perform poorly when they do. And just a little statistic. In our region, it has been quoted in a CARICOM document that a little bit over 70% of our students fail to achieve 5 CXCs with English and math. That, you know, is what is needed to get into the civil service. It's what's needed to get into university. Over 70%. Now think about it. We are having an education system that are therefore failing most of our students. So what do we do about that? I was having a conversation with the Right Honorable Dr. Didicus Jules, the Director General of the OECS Commission. This was in a recent personal conversation. And what he had to say to me is really worth considering here. He suggests that the current system can be replaced by one in which there is a basic core of subjects, including some from the TVET field, in which all students must show competence on exiting secondary education. I wish to suggest that this certifying in core areas can span their entire secondary school career, or students can start building their portfolio of subjects from third form at secondary school, rather than waiting to sit several examinations, 12, 13, 14, 15 in the fifth form. Assessment can be done using a variety of ways, including portfolios, competency-based approaches, and of course, where appropriate, written tests. You don't throw out something because it is rigorous, but you consider when to use it. This would increase the proportion of our students who leave school with certification at the secondary level. It certainly would move it above that mark, that statistic that I just gave you. Those students who complete this core of subject early can then spend the remainder of their secondary education phase exploring areas of specific interest, working in cooperative, collaborative groups on projects that allow them to build knowledge and skills in specific areas that they may want to pursue after secondary school, either in higher education or in the world of work. This may include internships and service learning projects. Perhaps there are other innovative and relevant ways of assessing students' learning that allow more of our students to feel engaged, valued, and able to contribute to their community, their country, and the region. Currently, there is much talk, as I said before, about a STEM curriculum, where the emphasis is on science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. I'm all for having such a focus on STEM, but I believe that something is missing. And I know nowadays we talk about STEAM, where the arts is placed in there. I believe that something might be missing. I recently came across an article published in September just gone that excited me as to what that something might be: entrepreneurship. The authors, Marwa Elthani and Nasser Mansour, used the acronym eSTEM to depict this concept, where the E in the front stands for entrepreneurship. In this paper, it says the eSTEM model was developed to promote entrepreneurial practices into STEM disciplines and prepare students for the market. This, to me, is worth consideration. I believe that education for self-reliance in our region should promote entrepreneurship, not just preparing students for existing jobs, but preparing them to create their own opportunities for generating income to support themselves, their families, and their wider community, country, and region. This approach to education would expose students to ways of thinking about the environment and ask questions such as, what else can we do with the resources that we have? They would learn to work collaboratively, to assess a problem, and then seek solutions that can be implemented. Where the solutions may be the development of a service or product that is marketable, not only in their own context, but in other jurisdictions for revenue-generating purposes. This would involve spending time trying out the created products. If the results are not what is desired, deciding what needs to be changed and then changing it. This helps students to develop persistence and grit. These are qualities that are critical for people who are aiming for self-reliance, for independence. One of the things that keep a country independent is that the fact that our citizens seem to suffer from risk aversion. They're unwilling to try out something unless they know that it will definitely work. But innovation is creativity. Innovation and creativity include being unsuccessful, but being able to persist. A self-reliant, independent people are able to deal with failure, recognizing that it is a function of a creative process and not a reflection of their intelligence. Perhaps methods of instruction would be of a nature, therefore, that encourages critical thinking. This would involve students and teachers learning how to weigh facts, to inform decision-making. Research skills, especially action research, should be emphasized. Students would learn how to interrogate evidence for veracity and accuracy, not accepting things that are shown to them as absolute truth. This ensures that when they see things in the media, they're able to ask the right questions. They learn to distinguish between fact and fiction. They learn how to present evidence to support their arguments. They learn to communicate, to resolve issues through dialogue and reasoning. These skills transcend the classroom into everyday lives. A self-reliant people are able to resolve differences of opinion without resorting to wanton violence. This could reduce the loss of valuable lives of people who can contribute to the development of their communities and their countries. Those participating would contribute to a truly independent, self-reliant community. Education should encompass teaching and learning activities that encourage innovation and creativity. Content would be integrated and cross-disciplinary, focused on problem solving that draws on content from across various disciplines. Assessment should be problem-based, calling for skills from across fields. Learners at all levels would work in the collaborative teams, drawing on their areas of strength and their talents, both natural and those developed, be it drawing, coloring, writing, building, photography, organizing people, or information. Whatever it may be, to create and to innovate. As students move up through the grades, through the education system, the task and project would become more complex, drawing on more advanced knowledge and skills. Colleagues, remember, this is just my ideal. It might be idealistic, but this is how I see it. This is not just a fanciful idea, in my opinion. Not just a fanciful opinion. Ladies and gentlemen, this is my vision, to see systems of education in the region that are homegrown and relevant to our people. But I'm aware that it may never happen in my lifetime, at least not anytime soon. But it is Bob Marley, and my brother played that tune. It is Bob Marley who told us that none but ourselves can free our minds. And that is what it will take for us to free our minds of the illusion that we have been fed in the name of education. I also sense that people have developed a sense of learned helplessness that paralyzes them, that keep them from acting. There is a sense that those in positions that can make it happen may be too indoctrinated to change. They may not want a change because they may no longer stand out as special or as superior. But ladies and gentlemen, unless we can get over these hurdles, despite flying flags to proclaim our independence, we will remain independent, tied to a system of education that was not designed for our benefit and that continues to serve the interests of the absent colonizer, who, though not physically present in the region, has left a legacy that lives on. May we as a people find the courage, the grit, and the will to change. May we make the decision to be truly independent and throw off the cloak that keeps us independent on others. Our generation may not be the one to experience the power of this true independence. But if we establish systems of education that is designed to help our young people to develop characteristics and skills such as critical thinking, creativity, entrepreneurship, collaboration, and leadership, to make them feel valued, respected, and cared for, then we would have given them the building blocks and tools for them to craft a niche as countries that can steer their own ships, that can be independent and self-reliant at home, as well as to manage their own affairs collectively as a region in the global arena. They will themselves benefit from their own creativity as they share their culture, their products, services, and their intellectual property. Then there will no longer be independence, relying on external sources for economic support, but truly independent, flying their flags with grace, integrity, and honor. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you.
I think to put it very simply, I would say that the message is out. What do I mean when I say the message is out? I have sat for about almost an hour, and what I have heard the voice of a true educator. I have heard the experience of 35 years and of institutional memory of all levels where Brother Joel has been able to make his contribution. And I say to all of you here tonight at the open campus, and those of you who are listening to this lecture, wherever you may be, I would invite you again to applaud Brother Joel. I emphasize that because quite often when we hear of lectures, we think of intellectual discourses. But if we are to contextualize the very fact that we have been celebrating our 43rd anniversary of national political independence, we must begin to think of the opportunity that that anniversary is presenting to us today to begin to critically examine a very important aspect of our state of affairs. And that resonates very well and truly where education is concerned. So what I have heard is a critique of the education system, revolutionary ideas that once we embrace them or begin to consider them, it will assist us in bringing about what I call a true conversation that we need to have about the role of education in our going forward as an independent sovereign nation, one which would truly reflect our realities and will help to further nurture our national identity as a people, and of course, as a region, wherever the same may resonate. I believe that you have had more than a mouthful because Brother Joel has taken you from the historical in terms of the philosophical percepts, the different schools of thought, as well as, of course, providing us more importantly, I believe, with his own ideals. With his own ideals which are based on his experiences and not the theory of what he may have been exposed to, but the realities. And I think we need to have a sober reflection of those, if I may call them recommendations, because they speak to my mind volumes. Why do I say this? For example, you mentioned the fact that there is STEM, there's STREAM, there are a whole lot of things out there. The need for the curriculum to change, etc. But there was one thing that I found very inspiring among all the many things that you've said. Not that the rest aren't, they very much are. But more importantly is the idea that entrepreneurship should be integrated somewhere in that reform of the education system. I think it is absolutely and vitally important for any developing post-colonial nation entrepreneurship is key and critical to the creative abilities of our young people. And the freedom, as a matter of fact, which you spoke of, because I believe fundamental or at the core of what you have projected this evening is the freedom. Not to be independent. I do not want to extend myself too much in terms of my own understanding of what you have said. And at this point in time, I would want to open the floor and to have reactions to your expose. And I saw the Honorable Minister of Education making quite copious and a lot of notes, and I am sure that he would have quite a lot to say at this point in time, and I therefore take this opportunity to open the floor and to invite your comments, your suggestions, and of course your reactions.
Good night, Professor Warrican. I'd just like to thank you for your presentation, which I have found to be stimulating, and I'm sure that I'm not unique in that respect. I just wanted to make some points and ask some questions related to some of the ideas which were presented. You gave a statistic, for instance, about the number of persons who have been turned out of the system as failures, quote unquote, because of the fact that they didn't attain mathematics and English at the CXC or CSEC level, as it is called these days. So I have a query in relation to that. Does it mean that we should, I mean, I don't know what the statistic will be if you just consider persons who have attained 5 subjects, whether or not both maths and English are a part of those 5 subjects. And I don't know if the suggestion is therefore that we should de-emphasize the importance of maths and English within the sphere of subjects, which I think might be something quite interesting for consideration by the education administrators. I think there has been a very clear suggestion as well that there's an overemphasis on assessment, both at the exit assessment level for primary schools and also at the CXC level. I've heard the suggestion of a different type of model, which to me is possibly assessment in a different format. But notwithstanding that, I was just wondering if there are any ideas that you might have in relation to an alternative method or system for the placement of students into secondary schools that could possibly be in consideration in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. One of the other things I think we probably should pay attention to in a conversation about education is that the school is not the only place of education, and we have many different, a student might be stimulated along one particular line or the other outside of school. So whereas the school right now is a forum for academic achievement, you might have, for instance, organizations responsible for coaching. You know, coaching sports, be it cricket, athletics, otherwise, that allows persons to develop talent in those areas. And I believe it is fair to say that there is a certain prestige associated with sport and achievement that perhaps pales in significance in some areas to the prestige associated with academic achievement. So is it a case where we have to recognize that in the system, or do we need a system that probably incorporates that to a greater extent and also goes further possibly to the point of having specialized education in areas where students may have a certain distinction at an earlier stage. For instance, is there a need for perhaps at the third form stage for the possibility of specialization in dance or plumbing or drama or sports, whatever the case might be? I think that might be something that could be considered. In the course of the presentation, you made reference to the fact that one of the very important things that we should have built into an education system is the teaching of self-reliance. I found that thread to be represented in Michael Manley's book, The Politics of Change, as well. And he presented some ideas there which I think are relevant to this discussion, including the fact that children in primary school in the Caribbean hardly are exposed to agriculture in a meaningful way. He was suggesting that that should be almost an everyday activity. We also hear from him the idea that an exposure to mechanics and automotive repair at a very early age might be in order. We have to perhaps give some consideration to physical education as well in like manner. So I think that those are some points that could perhaps attract a bit of a response from you. And then since we're having an independence presentation, and the whole idea is to give some consideration to the question of whether or not we are independent or in a state of dependence, I thought that we could possibly reflect to an extent on the 3 pillars of independence which were advocated by a former leader in the Caribbean. One being political independence, the other being economic independence, because, you know, in a state of neocolonialism, you will have a measure of economic dependence. So, and then the matter of social justice. So I am wondering the extent to which our education system could help us to preserve and extend our political independence, as well as contribute to our economic liberation, and finally, to help us to become advocates as may be necessary for change in a way that is beneficial for social justice purposes. Thank you.
So I'll attempt to comment on the questions and suggestions. Not sure that you're going to get full answers. The question about whether we should be de-emphasizing math and English, absolutely not. I think we have to think more about how we teach math and English, and my voice is going. So we have to think more about how we teach math and English. Math is important in almost everything we do. And the reality of the situation where English is concerned, we have not yet reached the point in our development where we are bold enough to say the languages that are inherent to us, what we refer to as the creoles, should be our national languages, should be our official languages, and should be our language of business. We are very much not there yet. We can have a conversation on that at another time. But until that is solved, math and English have to still be a big part of what we do. The problem is how they are taught. We teach English as if our first language is English. You know, we're talking regional. So for example, in St. Lucia, there are children whose their first language is a French Creole. In Haiti, in Dominica, a French Creole. But they may be taught in Haiti, the official language of French. Well, Haiti has now moved a little bit beyond that. But St. Lucia, Dominica. In St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and we speak a Creole, an English-based Creole, That's naturally what we start with. But we teach English as if that Creole is either non-existent or that it should be stomped out. You know, it should not be used in the classroom. The interesting thing is that quite often the people who want it stomped out, when they get on a platform or when they get in a space where they're public speaking, they draw on that Creole, you know? So we see it as cultural, we see it as a place for certain things, but we do not see it as an official language. So we are not there yet. So we have to think of how we teach English, recognizing the role of the Creole in it and the importance of the Creole. So I'm not at all saying minimize math and English, but it's how we teach them. In terms of alternative method for entering secondary school. So my problem with the assessment is that the assessments are used to rank the students. I have no problem that we do assessments. Assessments, that's how we measure learning quite often, whether it be an exam, a test, or whether it be an observation, whether it be a portfolio. The problem is that we use that assessment to send some children into the high-ranked schools and some into the lesser-ranked schools. If we have places for all children, why do we need to rank? Now, I am not going to say how we do this, because I believe that this needs a regional conversation. That is how I see it. Everybody talks about Finland, for example, but I've visited Singapore, I've visited Finland, where they boast of the great education system. And Singapore, I have to say, we must remember the state, the political state of governance, and that children, in many ways, when they enter a classroom, they must be obedient and so forth. It's a different kind of system. But Finland is more instructive. When you go to Finland and you talk to the education persons, they tell you that this education system we have was not built by the political idea of a leader, one leader, the government in power. How it was done, it was the government, the opposition, civil society, and others coming together to look at what needs to be done to get the best education. That is what we need to do in our region. We need to engage everybody to hear how we can build something that is truly Caribbean, that represents an education that offers social justice. But just to take this a little bit further, because you talk about specialized education, specialist education, I'm not sure how we interpret that one. I believe that we can have centers of excellence in every school. Strongly believe that. But first of all, I don't believe you should be taking one set of children and putting them in this school and one set in that school. It can be a random selection. It can be from an area all going to that same catchment area. I'm not prescribing, I'm just saying these are things that can be done. But wherever they go, it would have a mix of students. The so-called top students, so-called weaker ones. A mix of students, and within that school, you can have centers of excellence. It need not be one center. So you can have IT academy in that school. You can have a sports academy in that school. You can have an art academy, so that children can gravitate to those academies. But not at the same time, they're exposed to a broader education along with those type of things. So I wouldn't call it a specialist education. I would look at it more as being exposed to an academy within the school. The notion of self-reliance. Nairi talked about agriculture, and I know others talk about people who are mechanics and so forth. I like to say the self-reliance we're talking about here now, we have to be practical, and we've got to picture our young people. If we, yes, we are an agricultural nation to a certain extent. We depend on tourism, agriculture, and so forth. But if we ask many of our young people to go into the fields and work, to be entrepreneurial in the fields, by doing it the traditional way, we are not going to get much takers. So I believe in the agriculture, but what we have to teach in the schools is the technology that drive agriculture. So we might have to move to things like the hydroponics and so forth. How do we get effective farming we don't have large land masses, so how do we get great yields by using the technology? That's the thing we'll have to pay attention to. In terms of the political, economic, and social justice, I think a lot of what I speak about really is linked to these three concepts. So that if you have a proper education system that engages students to think independently and to question the author, question the speaker, and so forth, we're moving towards political thought. Because when you're thinking now about the decisions you have to make as a voter, you're pulling together all those things that you have learned. If you get an education that is sound, you're moving towards economic independence, because that is the education that is going to help the country to grow. And then the social justice. When we talk about the examination and the changing of the curriculum and making it fair for the people who we deem that 10%, this is indeed the social justice aspect that we are talking about. How to be fair, how to be just. So I think in a sense that's what I'm aiming for.
Professor Warrican, I want to thank you for that, I consider, wonderful presentation. Unfortunately, we hear these kinds of presentations, and that's the end of it. I would really like to see this forming the basis of workshops among teachers, education administrators, because I think what you presented tonight is really very important as we celebrate and reflect on independence. Now, your critique of colonial education, I'm reminded of the African writer Wathiongo, who says that who sees education and culture under the colonial system as a bomb. He said that when you are controlling a people or conquering a people and you use guns, that's only powerful when you have the guns pointed at them. But if you get rid of guns and you control education and you control culture, then you have everything made for you. I'm glad you mentioned Julius Nyerere, because what I find about Julius Nyerere was that his view of education and what he wanted to do with education compared with what he was doing to the society as a whole, where he wanted to carry his country. And I find that in the West Indies, in the Caribbean generally, there seems to be a gap between where education is going and where the society is going, generally speaking. And so sometimes it's difficult to pull those together. But I want to also ask you a question, because I think you touched on it in a sense. Every year, when I hear about students getting 15 subjects at CSEC, I wonder what's the point of all of that. And what you are talking about in terms of how you see us going forward, there's really no room for that sort of thing. And I wonder why you put a student through this to do 15 subjects. I mean, some of them are capable of doing it, but what is the point of it? Because to get into university, you don't need 15 subjects. And I just want to come, because I think it's something which we need to try and tackle. You have somebody who's doing 5 and another who's doing 15. And of course, the person who's doing 15, applauded in the newspaper and everybody. So everybody feels that they have to do that in order to get some sort of recognition. So I just wanted some comment on that.
Thank you, Dr. Fraser. Thanks for your comments. And the question is really a pertinent one, because I myself have been pondering over this for quite some time. And I practice what I preach. So I have 2 kids who did CXC, and I said no more than 8. So I think they did 7 each. One of those is now doing a PhD. One started university, but take a pause to play cricket. He's an international cricketer. Another son of mine, I thought the Caribbean system was failing him because he had a technological interest. And so what we decided, this one subject that you have called IT was not enough. So I sent him to the US to finish his last 2 years of school, where he ended up in an IT academy in the school. So 15 subjects, what does it do? The trouble is, you get the 15 subjects, it doesn't give you a national scholarship. I am not sure that it really says much except that you're able to pass some subjects after lots of grilling. Many of the students who do not do it are just as good, just as intelligent, and so forth. So the question really is, why are we doing it? But the trouble is, we reward these students. And that is the trouble. We reward them. They're the ones who get the top awards at CXE. So we are actually perpetuating it. We are actually saying this is the way to go, you know, versus taking a decision like a country like Barbados, that in the schools, you're allowed only 8 CXEs, sometimes 9, but it's a policy that you do 8 CXEs, because anything more is really just burdensome. You can go outside and do it, but not within the school system. Or you can do some in 4th form and then some in 5th form. Right. But there are some people, some schools across the Caribbean, where I've even heard one student, 21 subjects. I mean, why are we doing it? I have not been able, I can't answer your question properly, have not been able to see it. Why? I just would say, where my kids are concerned, I know that it's a no-no.
There's a question from our virtual audience. Please comment on the presence or lack of an articulated philosophy of education of the 21st century guiding the education enterprise and practice in St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
I cannot comment on something like that. In the sense that maybe the person wants. I think that I'm going to speak about the OECS right now, because I see St. Vincent in the grouping of the OECS and with a shared sort of education system and a shared curriculum. I see a philosophy that guides the OECS curriculum. I see the student-centered approach that they're promoting, constructivism that they're promoting, that every learner, every student can learn. So I see a philosophy. As to how it translates into the classroom, I think that is more the issue. So I think there is a guiding philosophy. When you listen to persons in the ministries of education across the Eastern Caribbean and across the Caribbean, there is that guiding philosophy. I think there's a breakdown between philosophy and practice, because we can talk constructivism all we like. We can talk about student-centeredness. We can talk about things like integration, but is that what is really happening in the classroom? I think that is the issue. So how is that corrected? I think that we need a stronger system of leadership coming from the ministry level with education officers, acting as coaches and mentors and support persons in the school system. And we have to bear in mind that we're talking about small developing states where we do not always have the resources. Sometimes we know that which is right and can't put them in place. So we need to have that. Then we need principals who understands that leadership role and the mentorship role that they should be playing in school, the supervisory role. We need to make sure we have senior teachers who understands themselves as teacher leaders, taking up the mantle of leadership in the schools. Not only the principal and deputy principal are leaders, but the teachers themselves are leaders. So you need that leadership and that aspect happening from top all the way down, or from bottom up, however you want to look at it. I think that's really the issue.
Thank you. Excuse me a moment. The driver for PE 586, somebody would like to pass, please. Mr. Daniel, may go ahead.
So, Oregon, good evening, and thank you very much for that very brilliant presentation. And I say so on behalf of the audience here and the audience online. But I have a quick teaser. I wonder whether, and I want to start where you started. You asked a very important question. What is the purpose or function or role of education? A philosophical question. And I'm wondering if we shouldn't take that question a little further. Meaning, for me, the question is not what or not necessary to be what is the role of education, before we answer the question of what is the role of the citizen, or if we put it in another way, if we contextualize it to St. Vincent, where do we see ourselves in another 20, 30 years, when hopefully my children and perhaps grandchildren will be alive and the leaders of this space that we call home? So the question for me is, if we could figure out, if we could answer the question where we are going or where we see ourselves as a society. And I like to use the word compassion. I think if we see ourselves as a compassionate society, what are the things that we need to do now in our education system, in tourism, in agriculture, in community life, in our politics? So I think, and I know this is not is a generalized question, but I just want to tease you a little bit, because for me, if we are going to answer that question, that philosophical question that you posed earlier, it seems to me that we have to answer that other question. Where are we going as a society, and where do we see ourselves? If we agree that we want to be X society, then the question of education and the function of education will necessarily fall in line. I just want to tease you a little bit and get your thoughts on that. Thank you very much, sir.
Well, I'm not sure you're gonna tease me much, because I think the nature of the question is one of reflection, that one that asks us all to reflect on where we see ourselves as a region going, what do we see the role of our citizens as, and maybe thinking about things like civic education and what it means to be a Caribbean citizen. How are we placed in the global space and so forth? So I think it is something for us to reflect on. I don't think it is something that for me to give an answer to. I'm sorry if I'm failing this test, but I'm not prepared to go down that route. I really think that as a group, as a people, we have to think together where we want to go.
And I should have been a little bit more specific. The big question in the globe right now is sustainable development, the whole question of climate change. In our curriculum, I don't, and I'm speaking here with some a little knowledge. In the region, certainly in the OECS, and I know we are making moves to change that, we have not even started to include the question of climate change in our curriculum. I know some countries are a step ahead, but I think outside of, say, Belize and perhaps Guyana, one or two others, certainly in the OECS, and I must agree with you, I know the OECS desk is working on some new things in education. But we have not even contemplated the question of education for sustainable development. Our curriculum doesn't have, doesn't speak to that at all. So that is one particular example I was getting at.
So Ronnie, there are some things I wanted to speak about, but in the interest of time, I couldn't. And so in a sense, I'm glad you asked the question. So I'm going to emphasize it. I didn't mention that, in my opinion, while we have a distance to go, I see the OECS Commission as doing a really excellent job of addressing these things. And if you say the OECS Commission is doing an excellent job of addressing these things, it is therefore the ministries of education in the OECS they are moving towards that. As to, it's the beginning of the journey. So I don't want to move away from what I said earlier. This is really the beginning of the journey. So I know the OECS is doing a mass curriculum review right now. And they're talking a lot about sustainable development and resilience and these type of things, having issues of gender and so forth as cross-cutting themes in their curriculum. So that is being done. And you see that happening in other jurisdictions in Jamaica and so forth. In terms of sustainable development and linked to education, that is why the School of Education, which I head, we went out and we sought funding to set up a research center and gain that funding from USAID through a project called RISE, Research Initiative Supporting Education in the Caribbean. This is to do the type of research that is needed in education that touches on things like climate change, sustainable development, health, the effects of lifestyle diseases on education on our children, and so forth. So again, there is a greater recognition of these things. In the School of Education, we talked tonight about things that have not happened in our education. Out of this funding from USAID, we are revising all our programs right across the board, from associate degree to PhD, where we are ensuring that we have centered in these programs issues of sustainable development, climate change, resilience, gender issues, and all of these type of things that we are grappling with. We are making sure that we put them in the curriculum so that these can be trickled down to teachers. So I think there are movements. Is it happening fast enough? Is it happening on a large scale, on the scale that it should be? I would say no, but I see positive movement towards them. But much more need to be done.
Yeah, good night, Mr. Warwick. I like to say when I come here tonight, I meet you playing a song from Mali, Emancipate Yourself from Mental Slavery. That is an ordinary man. He's not no academic and he's been in university, but he's a wall man. Another thing again, they have a fella in Trinidad. They will rather sing about him. The fellow who made the pan, the steel pan. He was no academical, but he created something in the Caribbean that, when we say the 21st century instrument, the point I want to make. And let me ask another question. That goes for the educational people. They must do some research in Cuba to find out how much non-academic individuals in Cuba after the revolution play serious role in strengthening the people's mind, because one the problem I have in my country and a lot of them other Caribbean countries, but St. Vincent's particular, they don't recognize the importance of a poet, calypsonian, artist, because coming from an educational point of view, and they don't understand the importance of synchronizing with the masses and trying to interpret how they're sitting and try to bring it to them. Another problem I just encounter daily, I hear people cussing about politics. Ask them, what is politics? You have a problem. And I think the educational system must educate the people. Basically, the simple thing, politics is the science and art of management. Your party, important to the country. So when we get a knowledge of politics, what is politics, management, we go stop argue over man, and we go argue over management. I think that is one of the fundamental problems wrong with our political discourse in our country. We fail to educate the people on what is politics. And education, politics, and social justice had to be the way forward if we're talking about post-colonial construction. So we must link education, politics, and social justice in a way that the masses could understand and be a part, and so they could feel when they put a politician in a place, they understand why I do that. Not because they give me a $20 a jersey, based on ideas. Okay, my brother?
Yes. My friend, it's good to see you. Haven't seen you in a long time. Thanks for that. And I pretty much, in a sense, we encapsulate a lot of what I'm trying to say, in that we have a system that seems to value just academics. And the other things, we label them as the other. But many of our great nation builders are not so-called academics. And just one thing, I don't think you should refer to Bob Marley as an ordinary man. You know, Bob Marley is one of our quintessential Caribbean person, a builder of nation, you know. So, but the point you're making, I quite agree that we have to stop seeing this dichotomy and realize that everybody in our nation can be nation builders.
Professor, good night.
Good night.
I was very impressed with your delivery. And you talked about not probably being around to see it, the manifestation of your plans, of your suggestion. But judging from the color of my hairs, I would hope that you would be around to see it started. Now, you said that the young people were not inclined to use traditional systems in agriculture. That might be true, but I would think that what we could expect is that the young people would bring innovative ideas to the agricultural sector if we give them the support. For example, now our young people the children of agricultural families can't go to the land because there's no road. Now, for example, if you have 6 students coming to Kingstown for the higher education, 3 of them are the children of farmers, and 3 of them are interested in insurance and business in town. But those 3 in Kingstown can drive to the office and sit in the air-conditioned office, etc., etc. Reliable transportation. But you're asking the other 3 to walk to the mountain, 3 miles to the mountain, and walk back, and expect them to be enthusiastic about that. In addition to that, the marketing arrangements. No marketing arrangement. Look, we had a banana thing going there, and for years we hear our Minister of Agriculture promising to revitalize the banana industry. It has not happened. Our friends, the Taiwanese, were here, and they indicated, they seemed to be suggesting that they're willing to help us with our bananas. Nothing happened. But they went across to St. Lucia, and St. Lucia is now exporting bananas to the United Kingdom. I am saying that if we have that income coming, it could help a lot. We won't have to go and beg people for stuff. You know? So I think that we ought to give some attention. And those of us who have any influence in this society must induce our leadership to see why we are not shipping a couple tons of bananas to earn a couple $1 million. Now, sir, I'm sorry to have you on your leg, but what, because you did a long presentation, et cetera, and what I have to say now is probably tangential. But from the mound on which I sit, I cannot seem to avoid the conclusion that our scholars have let us down badly. Those ones who had presented themselves as having been inspired to pursue the advancement of our society's well-being and development on the strength of their higher education and their projected intellectual maturity, it had been expected that they could have been relied on to protect the interests of the community. as it is reasonable to accept that those who have a clear view from the hill are better positioned to determine where the river can be safely crossed. So it is that those who have the bright light should lead the way. In St. Vincent and the Grenadines today, because we talk about St. Vincent Independence, right? In St. Vincent and the Grenadines today, the indifference of the authorities to the reasonable, desirable maintenance of services so elemental to the well-being of the society is palpably evident. That is testimony enough that those who had been entrusted with leadership have failed. That failure is crippling the hope that the next generations will be able to prosper. We are indeed leaving them with a significant debt burden while we are recklessly weakening the economic base on which they must stand. Clearly, St. Vincent and the Grenadines is not on the same road we thought we had set out on in 1951, when adult suffrage afforded us the right to elect our own governors. A review of the approaches of our local administrators since our attainment of independence in 1979 will do their legacy no honor. Their modus operandi suggests that the desire for control of the power which the colonizers enjoyed is what has been motivating them. Their untrustworthiness, arrogance, and malfunctioning of the judicial system is testimony to that. Their approach to what they call development is to facilitate expatriates, the progeny of former slave owners, to own and control our lands, while the locals, the progeny of ex-slaves, must face a future in which the hope to develop and prosper is strangled. Testimony to their lack of maturity and orientation to development is documented in their pronouncements that we cannot depend on agriculture to enhance our development. They say we have to depend on tourism. Allow me just a minute. About 14 years ago, we're talking education and development, it's relevant. About 14 years ago, one of our prominent scholars, a technocrat, whose elevation saw him assuming a prominent role in the administration of our sub-region, informed us that our sub-region, the OECS, could get food cheaper if we imported collectively from outside of the sub-region, implying that we did not need to pay attention to agriculture. Today, our food import bill is choking us, and all the nations of the world are preoccupied with the issues of food security. What leadership? The British are still enjoying a good standard of living because of the wealth they generated from the cultivation of our land, which is among the most fertile in the world. It is hoped that the new wave of scholars will recognize their responsibility to the society and use their talents to advance the well-being of the citizens. Thank you for listening.
Yes. I want to thank you for your intervention. I welcome, of course, the enthusiasm with which participants are engaging in this discourse. But I think it is equally important for us to bear in mind that we have a restricted, sort of time frame within which to operate. Therefore, it would be useful to consider that there are others who also may want to make a contribution. So I would leave I would hope that. That's all right. That's all right. It's okay. It's okay. It's okay. It's okay. I'm just trying to get some more reactions here. And as I said, I thank you for that. Thank you.
Good night. I just want to say, as a teacher, I share many of your views. But I would like to touch on an issue, get your thoughts on the issue, related to education, yes, but unrelated to the curriculum. Now, we know across the region, even in St. Vincent, a number of schools have been facing backlash as it relates to the dress code, and of course, what students are allowed to wear, their haircuts, So I was wondering, what's your thoughts on that? Do you agree that, your dress code or your hair, how big it is, it does not affect how you learn, or it does not affect, your ability to be a good and well-rounded citizen?
I see you have been, every effort is made to draw me into some national affairs, but if I stand up and proudly say I'm Vincentian, then I guess I should get in. I have always taken the view, and I know this is controversial, that learning and hairstyle and dress should be separated. I cannot understand if we're talking about colonial times versus now. I cannot understand why a boy with long hair is asked why to cut his hair, or the notion that it is not well groomed. To me, it is a little bit troubling when that person is actually learning. Is he being disruptive? That's a different thing. And if you're in class, if you're in school, and you're not a disruptive person, but you come with your hairstyle, I don't see a major issue with it. But at the same time, what seems to happen is that depends on your hair type, you get away with more. And that, to me, I have a problem with that. We have had situations, and I'm talking regionally, where because a person have had locks, a student, there was a time when you wanted them to cut their hair. There are countries in the region where once upon a time, if you entered those countries with dreadlocks, you were sent back. So that's how serious this thing when it comes to things of hair and so forth. I don't want to say anything really that disrupt what the school system has enforced, but my personal belief is that hairstyle is not the critical issue. We spend time talking about things like hairstyle and how you dress, and not enough time on learning, and that bothers me. So I have no problem if you're enforcing rules for dress code and so forth, if at the same time I'm seeing that you're really engaging our children in a way that have them learning, and that you're seeing successful learners leaving school with a higher percentage pass rate and so forth. But we seem to be grappling with those things that are tangential to the important things of learning. That has been my perspective all throughout my life, and I still stand by it. And the people who went to Teachers College with me would remember that I did do what was considered at the time, take steps that were not the best. They said you had to wear a uniform, but I was a person who was ending up in college without uniform. And as an educator, I find some dissonance in it, because I myself, having worked in schools, having worked at a college, have tried to enforce certain things. But it doesn't sit right with me, because it is not who I was as a student, and it really still is not who I am as an adult.
Good night, everyone. So, before I share my opinion, I must say that tonight was very, very educational for me, and I learned a lot that would help me in class next week, the sociology. So, as a young person, I'm 17 years old. Agricultural science has been my favorite subject for the past 3 years, and I recently attained a grade 1 for that subject. I think the problem is, well, with my generation, based on my observation, is that they only see agriculture as being a farmer. Now, for me, based on what I learned in school, you can be a plant pathologist, agricultural economist, not only a farmer, right? I think that they need to push the different careers that agriculture produces more, and maybe the students would be more intrigued to be a part of the agricultural system in the country and make a positive contribution to the agricultural sector. Thank you.
I'll just say thank you for that comment. It's well made, and I don't think it needs anything, but thank you. Very good point.
Good night, everyone, and good night, Professor Warrican. I would like to thank you for your presentation, but also for your influence as an educator. I am an educator as well. I teach at the community college and at Trinity Medical School. And when I first started teaching, Dr. Warrican was at the community college, and I was very impressed with his vision. And I believe a bit of that, or maybe a lot of it, has influenced how I try to teach. But I am concerned that the vision that you've outlined, I think it requires considerable buy-in. I think it reflects your sense of nationalism and regionalism, and I don't think that as a society that is particularly high right now. I think our society is fractured. I think we have a lot of financial constraints. For instance, if we were to, well, we can't do it overnight, but if we were to randomly assign students, I think it would be very apparent that the schools would not all be at the same level, and it would be great because then they would all have to be at that same level. But even now, a lot of the support that comes for some of our schools are from private donations, for instance, as opposed to a general standard. I also believe that we have a lot of attachment to our schools because, as you rightly pointed out, it promotes a stratification of society that some of us, myself included, have benefited from. And so I think what you're proposing really requires like a fundamental shift in how we think, because you're going to need a lot of different individuals to support this vision, which means it has to be something that supersedes politics. And I don't want to sound, I want to be hopeful, but I guess what I'm trying to figure out is, what do you see as the role of the average individual in helping this vision be realized? Because for it to be realized, people first have to share it. So how is it going to be shared? As an educator, there is, I think I have a bit more responsibility than most, and I try to use my influence responsibly, but I am limited, and other people who share your vision are also limited. So I guess I'm wondering what can be done, and what would you advise for everybody here in whatever their particular role is? If this is where we want a nation to go, then what should we start doing as of tomorrow to help that come to pass?
Thank you, Joan. Yeah, one of the bright sparks, and Khaleesi. Thank you for that question. Colleagues, I started by saying I want to avoid the politics. And the reason why I want to avoid the politics is not that I'm not political in nature. I'm quite political in nature. I believe in a party like everybody else. Well, some don't, but I believe in a party. But where education is concerned, I think it goes beyond politics. You know, I think that's what you're alluding to. No government in the region or no opposition in the region cannot put their hands up and say guilty of some of the things that we talk about. Because this system hasn't been in place forever, you know? So a system of stratification, when a person is in opposition and they go at the government about it, really and truly, it is unfair in a sense because they were in power at some point. And what happens is a cyclical thing, because when those in power gets into opposition, you see the same thing happening. So that's why I don't think this is about politics. This is really about how do we build our education system. I think we have got to do it. I believe in doing it as a region rather than as an individual country. That we identify people who can come together and plan And in doing that planning, we have to go to the people. We have to have the town hall meetings. We have to hear what people have to say. We have to get their ideas. And that vision becomes then a shared vision, not a vision of a political party, not a vision of any group, just a single group in society. It's a shared vision. Remember what I said happened in Finland. It was the governing party at the time, along with the opposition and civil society coming together. So, Joanne, public education is going to have to be a big thing. You have to draw on people. You have to go out in the communities and sell a message. You know, that group that you bring together to think about education. They can't see it as just their education. They have to go to the community, sell their vision, but invite them also to participate and give theirs. And then together, you come up with where we want our region to go educationally. This is really not about politics. At least that's how I see it. It is just not about politics. Where one party gets on the platform and tears the other down about education, we understand what politics is. Politics will be politics. So I'm not saying politics should not play. But when it comes to building the education system, we have to bridge that gap, come together, divide, come together, and work together towards that education. Must engage the people. That's important.
Thank you. Professor Warwick, I hope he wasn't throwing words just now. You know, I had the microphone and I said, well, I was only going to speak if my questions hadn't been asked by other persons. One of them was addressed. Of course, as a politician, your admonition just now about, speaking in a way that may seem to be partisan takes away from the overall project of trying to build the system, getting all the best views from wherever they come. But I want to thank you. I think your presentation was very solid, very sound, and a lot of very new information. Some of it we knew already, but hearing it from you, somebody who has studied it, who has a wider breadth of experience from what you've told us, and certainly isn't, though you are political, isn't colored by the politics of the moment. But I will just say one of the questions that I wanted to ask, I think it was John, alluded to it just now, that is you said about the assessment system being used, in your view, improperly for putting persons in particular schools, prestigious schools as opposed to other schools, and that there should be a better method of determining which schools people go to. And you suggested that perhaps the catchment area is maybe used to put persons in secondary schools or wherever. But that comes to the question of schools being of different caliber, different quality in the different parts of the country. And how do we go forward with that plan? And it is one that I personally support. Somebody from the Grenadines, knowing the difficulty of persons traveling here to go to the so-called prestigious schools here on the mainland. How do you address that? Secondly, you mentioned teasingly about the importance of technical and vocational education in the system. And at one point in your presentation, you said that it ought to be part of a compulsory program where all students would take it at some point, I think those are the words used, in the system. I wanted to expand a bit more on that because I've been giving some thought to this recently myself too, and trying to figure out exactly what point in the system and for how long, and the purpose of it. Is it to make it widely available, or in part to help take away the stigmatization that there is with respect to technical and vocational education? And then thirdly, the question of let's see, the third one here is, yeah, you talked about students who, having gotten 2 subjects, math and English, and five subjects overall, in a system where if they don't get those 5 subjects you considered, at least you used the term failure. I think that was challenged by one of the questioners. But it goes back even further than that. In the secondary school system that produces students with 21 subjects or 15 subjects, also, you have a cohort that may start in Form 1 in 2017 with maybe 40 students in the class. And then by Form 5, the graduating class has fewer than half those students. How do we then assess a system where you have the high flyers, as you suggested, critically, but the majority of the students, and I put it that way, I don't know what the exact statistic is, but anecdotally, there are some schools that you would start with a majority, say 40 students in Form 1, and by the time you get to Form 5, you're less than half those students. How do we assess the performance of a system, whichever country you want to choose as your example, to grade a system, an education system, that presumes that every child should go in as a matter of right? This is in the secondary school system, universal secondary education. So the presumption is that they will come out at the end of 5 years, which is the normal time frame of an education program. How do you assess a system where half of those students may not make it to Form 5?
Okay, thank you. So the notion of the catchment schools, I threw it out as one of the ways, but it's not a perfect way, and that is why I'm saying we have to plan this, we have to do this as a region, to bring our minds together to see how this should be done. Why it's not a perfect way? In the bigger countries, the developed countries where this is done, we know what can also happen. There are neighborhoods that we call inner city neighborhoods. When you have all the children from those neighborhoods going to that catchment area, in that area, it can be problematic because you do not necessarily have that diversity that you need. And worse yet, sometimes the attention that should be paid to them, that does not happen because they're not seen as important. Somehow they will not admit that as the catchments where the middle class and the rich send their children. So catchment area, school system, it's okay, but you'll have to think about how do you counteract those type of things. So that was just something I threw out, not to say that it is the way. If it happens, you have to make sure that all schools are of a certain quality. I think that is important. And I know in the system, when you talk to certain officials in the Caribbean, they tell you schools are allocated equal funding and all of that. But we're not talking about equality. We're talking about equity. So that if an area lacking certain things, they may have to get more than this school, though that even though you think all schools are equal, that school may have much more resources than the other. So you have to think about it carefully. In terms of the technical education, what I really want to see is the stigma removed from technical education. We have to see technical education as something that is as anything else. Now, I do not open the bonnet of my car because it intimidates me. But the same people who you want to reject as not being up to standard, that's the area that you want to push them in, where you're talking about cars that are computerized and so sophisticated. So it doesn't sit right. So we have to have a system where we recognize the importance of technical education, and that maybe many children who are not exposed to it, if they had been given that exposure, they might have moved towards one of the technical areas. And you have to expose the parents also, because I know of many parents who force their children into certain areas and say keep away from technical area. So they do not want their children to go to the technical division of the college. That is changing. You know, that is changing, and I'm happy to see that somebody from the technical division has been given a has earned, I should say, a national scholarship for an associate degree. But the key really is to let the populace recognize that technical education is as important as anything else. The 5 CSEC issue, I think what that highlights is that many of our children are failing in the school system. Some are getting the 5 CSEC, but not with those 2 critical subjects, English and math. And we have to rethink how we do it. That's really the point I'm trying to make. Not that these people are failing people, it's that the system is failing them. So how do we correct that? We have to think about instruction in a different way. We have to think about school organization in a different way, and so forth. A system where much in a cohort do not complete school, well, that really is linked to the point with the 5 CSEC. Something is definitely not right, and we need to improve that. I know you asked something else, but I think I am not understanding my own notes. How to access something? Okay. But I hope my answers have been satisfactory. I'll take one more question.
Yeah. Good night.
Huh? There are a couple more.
You sure? Okay. I was sitting. Thank you so much, Professor Warrican. I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation, and I feel very proud that it was brought by the Open Campus tonight. But while I was listening to you, I thought to myself, as my principal would usually say, when does the rubber hit the road? Because a lot of what you said, you said it was your ideas, you talked about OECS, you talked about ministry and so on. And I said, where does the doing get done? Because we can all have grand ideas, but where does the doing get done? So I was very happy when you started talking about teachers being trained with a new way of thinking, ministry officials being trained in a new way of thinking. And then I kept saying to myself, well, what about the people? Again, you said we have to involve people, we have to have popular education and so on. But my problem has been that those very people who we say we have in consultation with, we don't really think they know what they're talking about. We don't really listen to them. We don't think they know what they're about. And I was just wondering, how is that bridge going to be crossed? We're going to have open consultation with the very people who, a lot of them don't have this, are not high flyers. And how do we really appreciate that people, even if they're not high flyers, has something to offer? It's along the same theme that you're talking about with technical education and the 5 CXCs rather than the 15 and so on. But I just wonder, because I have seen it happen. We have consultations, people talk, and then obviously we don't think they are that. So we're doing very little. So I'm very concerned about that. Right. And thank you for saying what you said about streaming. I've always hated it. Thank you.
Okay. So thanks a lot for that, Mrs. Dalrymple. It is why I am suggesting that any reform ought not to be led by just a small group of people. I really believe that reform has to be regional, that it has to be led by people who buy into the concept that we need to make a better region. And to make a better region, we've got to involve everybody. So we are talking about elitism. That's what this education system have created, that some voices are greater than some. We perceive that to be the case. So how do we ensure that we get the public into it? If this is led by just a small group of elitists, because elitism hides itself, disguises itself, and when you think people come to you as people who understands and so forth, but quite often these are the same people who are quite elitist and really would only listen to a certain group. So that is why we need a wider group to tackle this. I think the Caribbean thinkers, and by thinkers I'm not talking about academics. I am talking about, yes, them. I'm talking about the church. I'm talking about youth groups. I'm talking about even people on the block and so forth, coming together and talking about what has failed them in this education, what they see has not worked well, what have we done well. It's important to know what we have done well. Across the Caribbean, for example, we have universal secondary education. That is something that we have done and should be applauded. But what has not gone well in that? We have to discuss that. You know, how do we tackle the little things in there or sometimes the big things that we can do better? We have people who have been product of it. So we hear from them. And we don't just use regional people. We also co-opt some persons from outside the region. Not because we talk about colonized and that we had colonizers and imperialists. That does not mean that we cannot seek help from outside of the region. We still can look to them for some level of help. But I think it is not a small group that should control what happens in our education system. We need to have a broad base and involve the community.
All right. I'd like to invite Hannah, and after that, the Honorable Minister of Education.
Professor, I'm glad that you mentioned, first of all, let me say excellent presentation. I'm glad I'm here tonight, and I gave you multiple high fives for certain points, right? And I'm glad you mentioned the universal access to education, right? So we boast of universal access to education, and we have that. But what happens to the students who are observed to be basically struggling to cope with higher order thinking or more information? You know, the students of low academic abilities, how do we help them? That is my thing. Forgive me if you did mention, but I don't think I heard anything about remedial studies. Personally, I love the universal access, right? But the thing about where students are placed, that's fine. But what happens when we realize that they're struggling with English, when they're struggling with math? What happens there? And I made a point. When you water and you fertilize your plants at home, we probably have living plants at home. When you water and you fertilize them every 2 weeks, they grow, they give us flowers. It's the same thing with our people. When we spend time with them, when we fertilize them, we basically hold a hand. They learn to walk, right? So it's the same way with our education system. When we hold the student's hand and we guide them, we realize that, you know, A and B has certain issues, we hold their hand. So from our leadership, what next? Yes, we have universal access to secondary education. Yes, it's commendable. But what next when we identify the problems, right? And another thing, I stand here as a very proud technical vocational education teacher, right? And I'm gonna say this, there's a saying that says, give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. But you teach a man to fish, and you feed him for a lifetime. That is what TVET does. So I think that great emphasis should be placed on technical and vocational education in our society, because we teach persons to fish. And they will go out there and they will, Professor Warrican highlighted entrepreneurship. They will go out there and they will become entrepreneurs. I pass my students selling things that they learn to make in school. And I'm very proud of them. And that is something that we really, really, really need to continue to focus on in our system.
All right. Thanks a lot, Hannah.
You're welcome.
I just want to say your point is a very valid point. But I just want to remind us where the region has come from. In the 70s, most education system had universal primary education. There was no universal secondary. In the mid-2000s, most of our countries, especially in the OECS, gained universal access. So what happened before universal access is that children finished primary school. If they did not pass common entrance, if they did not pass school events, they were out of school. So pretty much, on one hand, we are talking about the struggling students, which is very important that we tackle them, versus the issue of being out of school. We must always remember that. And I say that because I still meet people who say if you fail the common entrance, you should not go to secondary school. And I cannot countenance that. I cannot understand that, you know? So let's put that in the mix. I think where the region's education system has failed when it comes to universal access is that we recognized that it was important to provide that access. But I don't think that we thought through properly. How do we ensure that every learner succeeds? I think that is the problem. So I agree with the point you're making. So yes, we did the laudable thing of getting them into secondary school. But one, because of the stratified system of education, some of them went into schools that became almost holding grounds. And it doesn't mean that no learning is taken in those, is happening in those schools. Because every year you see from those same schools, quite a bit of children doing well. But I always like to say, is that the norm? Is that the majority? And that is what we have to tackle. The students who are struggling, they're not able, they're not bright, but maybe they learn differently. Maybe they miss something in their early childhood education, in their primary education, something that they should have part of the building block. So what we need to do is to tackle that. How do we get them all to learn? I think that's one of the things that our education ministries have got to tackle. But I want to say, I see somebody talk about the workshops. I rarely see much more of that happening in the region now, trying to tackle those things. So we have a program run, supported by CDB and CARICOM called Let's Read, where 3,000 teachers and principals are being exposed online to help children who have had learning loss because of COVID and even before COVID. So it is not right for us to say things are not happening. Things are happening, but I still emphasize the thing. Is it happening fast enough? Is it happening sufficiently? No. There's still a long way to go, but I'm seeing the steps being taken. But how do we maximize it? How do we speed it up? How do we make it efficient? That's what we have to think about. Minister?
All right, thank you very much. Good night, everyone. Professor Warrican, I sat there and I thoroughly enjoyed the presentation because I think it was very thought-provoking, very idealistic in my way of looking at it, given where we are now. But nevertheless, some very important points were made. And although I know that quite a lot of things came up that are being discussed, and as you have rightly said, people might not realize it, but there's in fact a process of what I would call educational reform that is still going on and has been going on for a long time now. I'm sorry, I'm not going to be basically reacting to anything that persons in the audience may have said. I'm just making a general point because, as was rightly pointed out, this issue is a national issue, and as such, we all should be involved. So I don't want it to be viewed or interpreted, whatever I might say, in that angle. I'm just making general comments, and of course I have a question for you. But I was making the point that if we take, for example, in the colonial period, basically what we had was a purpose for education, but that purpose was defined by those who exercise control over us. And in their way of looking at it, what purpose education served at the time, they ensured that the primary system, which was used for the basic education. And at the time, given that we were established, if you like, for the benefit of those who exercise power over us, control over us, it was felt that the primary system was adequate for the purpose of the education that they were offering. Since independence, successive governments had to grapple with the issue of transforming that colonial education to one that is solving or should solve more the developmental needs of our country. And it is a process that, as I'm saying, has been going on for a long time. Now, that process has been significantly driven by the OECS because these smaller territories that form part or form the OECS since 1980-81, right after our independence, basically what is happening, there is an integration process that is taking place between, among those countries. And quite a number of our major developmental challenges are tackled from that, if you like, integration approach. In other words, we seek to harmonize our education policies, we seek to harmonize our health policies, and so on and so on. In fact, not many persons know that when somebody from an OECS country enters another OECS country, that person basically has what we would refer to as certain rights that are almost tantamount to being a citizen of that country. So for example, I go to St. Lucia with my children. They are afforded education. Say I land Saturday, if I want them registered at school on Monday, the system allows for that. The point I'm making is that a lot of what we are doing are driven, are facilitated through that OECS process. Now, what the OECS has done since, now they have, with regards to education, okay, the OECS has from time to time, bro. Yes, I was saying, what they have done is that from time to time, they have, if you like, evaluate our education sector. And what they have done is basically to produce a report examining all the challenges, or most of them, if you like, of our education system, and come up with recommendations. I mean, those of you who have been following would know about the Foundation for the Future. I think that was done around the 1990s. Then we moved to the 3 Ps, partnership, progress, and perspective, or something like that. Pillars, partnership, and prospects. Again, evaluating the education sector and coming up with recommendations. And finally, there is in place now what we call the OECS educational sector strategy, which is running basically from 2012 to 2026. Again, which is seeking now to move away from the predominantly reform approach that was employed previously. In other words, it was felt that the education system that we inherited had many gaps. And these gaps, we are talking about a lack of access. You're talking about equity. You're talking about relevance and quality of education. And while the OECFs, as a collective, has done magnificently well in terms of giving greater access and doing a lot to have a more equal distribution of resources throughout the school system. The fact is, it was felt that the time has now come for us to, even while we continue to pursue those kind of reform, because we know we have not achieved what we want. We still have gaps. But even while we seek to fill these gaps, a greater emphasis now is being placed on aligning the education sector, or system, if you like, with our developmental needs. And so that when you hear the whole idea of this idea where we are articulating over and over again the creation of a post-colonial society that is modern. And you heard all the other features, must be regional and global and so on, national of course, starting. The fact is that we have to, in a sense, provide a completely, I don't want to say, well, I should change it, not necessarily a completely new system, but the point I'm making, that there are challenges that we have to overcome to get to that stage that we want to be at. So I just say that in way of a general statement on what is happening in the education system. But I want quickly now to touch on technical vocational education and training. This month is and it has come out throughout the night that we need to move from the traditional view of TVET, and we need to do a lot more promotions. Our ministry, we need to do a lot more promotions. Now, why am I saying this? Now, I still hear people talking about, okay, we are not an academic, not everybody is academically oriented. Hence, they can't make it, so put them to do TVET. We are moving away from that concept. Today, our basic education is delivered in all the childhood centers, primary school, and in the secondary school. Yes, secondary schools from Form 1 to 3 at present. I'd hope that soon it would be in the entire secondary school that we would be providing what we would consider to be a basic education. In other words, what we are saying, in order to get to that next stage, you must provide people, our citizens, with a basic education upon which they can build. So TVET is very important because TVET is competency-based. And what TVET is doing now is providing persons with an opportunity and leaving the institution to find employment or create their own employment. I heard the sister spoke. I listened to some graduates of the TVET program. And I keep saying to our officials, let us have more of these people in the media so that people can hear what is happening. People can get a sense of the impact of TVET. And so what that would do, it would help to change the stereotype that we have of TVET and have a more positive view. So that's on TVET. My question now, Professor Warrican. Now, you mentioned the whole issue of, well, you spoke about Singapore's education system. You spoke also about Finland. It's Finland. There's a little Caribbean country, Cuba. 50 years ago, 60 years ago, 70 years ago, 80 years ago, 90 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, where their experience over the last 60 or so years, I believe, has a lot of lessons for us in the education sector. Because what I am seeing is that given their experience, their relationship with the United States, they have fashioned an education system that is very much in keeping with their general societal and developmental goals. My question to you, given what we are trying to do, because we share similar history, how, well, first, I don't know how much, but I suspect that you will know something about the Cuban education system, but how do you see that system helping to, if you like, make our work easier by providing lessons for us to follow as we seek to do the same thing that they're trying to do, create a post-colonial and modern society?
Thank you. Minister, quite frankly, you have to look to other countries to learn a few things, to learn some things from them. But I didn't raise Finland nor Singapore as examples of where we're going to learn from. I raised them to say, people talk about them and their success. And yes, people speak of Cuba and their success. But the point I really wanted to make was that they're all contextualized. That we cannot reproduce Finland, we cannot reproduce Singapore, and I don't think we can reproduce Cuba in Siemens. Of course, there will be lessons from each of them, but I don't think that's where we look. I think what we have to do is look within ourselves to see how we can create a system that works for us, you know? So we have this block of the OECS, so let's talk about it in that point of view. The OECS Ministries of Education have got, in my opinion, to do what I suggested. Do the broad consultation, bring a broad-based committee together to do that consultation. A committee that is made up of educators, church leaders, youth leaders, people from the public service, people working as mechanics, as agriculture workers, and so forth, to see how we can build our education. I think we have to contextualize it. We have to recognize that we need a homegrown system, because what works in certain systems, because of their social structure, because of their political structure, because of things like immigration. When you look at Finland, for example, when we talk about diversity, when I went into the classrooms, all the children look pretty much alike at the time. Now we know there's a more migration issue in Europe, but they looked alike. So how do we use that system and borrow from it? We can't say don't borrow, but to use it as the embodiment of what we want to do when we are a more diverse place. We in our Caribbean space, I see us as quite cosmopolitan, and we see us as a place of different races and so forth coming together, different classes and so forth. How do we tackle that in our context, being island states for the most part, minus Guyana and Belize, with the insularity that we have, with our history, with our culture? How do we tackle? And I think it's the same thing when we look at Cuba. There are lessons to learn from Cuba. Cuba is an island state, like us. Different language, yes, but there are lessons to be learned. But in the end, I think we have to look within to come up with something that works for us in the so-called English-speaking Caribbean. We can learn some things from Singapore, we can learn some things from many of those systems, and we can, of course, learn from our neighbor Cuba. But in the end, we have to create something that is homegrown, that is us, that is English-speaking Caribbean. I say English-speaking in inverted commas. That is how I would answer that question. That's it. Thank you. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. That brings us to the end of the discussion forum for this evening's event. And I am sure you would agree with me, in my considered opinion, that this evening was an evening of excellence on all levels. First, excellence in the presentation of the lecture, and yourselves, excellence by way of your contributions and interventions. But as we have experienced every year, these discussions are full with the potential for further discussions, but we are constrained by time, and therefore we must give in to what are the demands and exigency of what we have been confronted with, and that is to bring this event to a close. And in doing so, I would like to take this opportunity to call upon and invite Ms. Zilpha Joyat, the PRO of the local chapter of the Guild of Students, to bring the vote of thanks.
Good evening, everybody. It is my distinct pleasure to raise this vote of thanks to all who have made this evening's lecture the success it has been tonight. You can certainly agree with me that it has been a wonderful evening of intellectual stimulation and conversation, so undoubtedly we must show appreciation for all those who have been directly and indirectly indirectly contributed to this lecture. Mr. Jamora Francis, for your beautiful musical renditions, we thank you. Father Orlando, for opening the lecture with prayers. Mrs. Dalrymple, for welcoming and bringing us greetings on behalf of the staff and students of the Open Campus and the wider university. To Mrs. Lackram, for beautifully introducing our special guest. To Ms. Shakira Pratt, our decorator, who has given us this visual beauty to our sides. Our moderator, Mr. Julian Jack, who has made good use of the time and so ably managed this evening's proceedings. Thank you very much. But while we are appreciating the food for thought presented by our guest lecturer, let us give him another round of applause for Professor Warrican for a quite insightful and relevant presentation this evening. Professor Warrican, we thank you for agreeing to do this lecture, and you have surpassed our expectations. Special thanks to the NBC Radio for the live stream on their Facebook page, the print and electronic media for their continued support of the Open Campus, Ms. Hannah Hamilton, the chair of the Interim Alumni Committee and the Open Campus Guild of Students Executive, who aided with the ushering, Mr. Kwesi Allen for designing the promotional material, Mr. Cap Balcom for videography and other technical support, the site staff of the Open Campus, the students, we thank you very much. I wish to single out on behalf of the Open Campus the Office of the Director of the St. Vincent and the Grenadines Community College for their support. The Open Campus would also like to express its heartfelt appreciation to the Commissioner of Police, Mr. Colin John, for his swift action in ensuring that Professor Warrican got here to St. Vincent on time. Thank you very much, and we do appreciate your timely intervention.
And finally, to our audience for being to our audience for being so gracious, I thank you. Without you, your presence, your participation, this event would have been a meaningless one. And for that, we appreciate you and thank you very much.
Once again, thank you very much, and we appreciate your presence, and we hope to see you next year. Godspeed.